Afternoon. Chandra, can you go ahead and start recording for me?
It is.
It is recording, thank you. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the high school teachers, or excuse me, we're going to be preparing you all for the shift to the new 2022 Louisiana Student Standards for Social Studies. This is a part of a webinar series that we've been doing this past semester. We are going to continue to do some webinars next semester for the remaining of the 2022-23 school year, but we just haven't nailed down those dates. So please keep checking our resource page for information about that. All right, so my name is Samantha Chasson. I am a social studies content specialist here at the Louisiana Department of Education. I'm in the social studies academic content team.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chandra Phillips. I am a social studies content specialist with the Louisiana Department of Education as well.
Great, so our session objectives. By the end of this session, you should be able to describe what supports will be available for high school U.S. history and civics, describe major shifts in content and skills for high school U.S. history and civics, and then describe the assessment transition from the high school U.S. history to the civics assessment. We are going to talk about all these later, so if this is new information, just wait 1 second. Also, if you are just joining us, please enter any questions you have in the chat and we'll try to address those at the end. So first, we're going to review some updates on some of the supports we previewed at the Teacher Leader Summit. We previewed our course frameworks. We're going to talk a little bit about those. Then we're going to review the changes in the high school civics and U.S. history courses, and then talk through the units and topics in the course frameworks. And then finally, we will be giving some guidance on how to begin having classroom teachers and coaches prep for the transition to the new standards. This is going to include resources to build their own content knowledge and a resource we've created to help teachers plan on using primary sources. Okay, so first, we're going to update everybody on where we are with reviewing instructional materials for social studies. So we recently finished creating a new rubric for our reviews. The rubric is posted on our site. I recommend all of you please go and have a look at it. It posted this past October. That's when the instructional material review process reopened. Once a vendor has submitted a product for review, the submission is posted in the weekly report. You can find the weekly report on the IMR homepage. Chandra is going to be dropping a link to that IMR homepage in just a second so you can see where that lives. All right, so the course frameworks. Again, we previewed these at the Teacher Leader Summit. So I just want to give you an update on how this is going. These course framework documents are going to replace the old scope and sequences. We are currently working with a really great group of teacher leader advisors from all over the state to get these done by spring, summer 2023. We'll be posting the units as we complete them on a rolling basis. These are not meant to be a full curriculum. They are frameworks. They will be developed for grades kindergarten through 8th, high school U.S. history and civics. And we're going to take a closer look at these for high school U.S. history and civics in a few minutes. Please keep in mind that these are currently under development. We will not be updating the ones that we have previewed for Teacher Leader Summit. We will not be updating that folder. We are instead going to be releasing units as they are completed on the K-12 Social Studies resource page. All right, so just really briefly, this is what the course frameworks will look like. They include sample framing questions, sample supporting questions, primary and secondary sources for students that will help them develop a claim for the supporting and framing question, key terms. The resources as much as possible will live in a Google Drive, so the links will not break. We do hear you whenever you tell us that that's a major issue with the scope and sequence documents. So we're going to try to prevent that as much as possible. And keep in mind, these are course frameworks there we are creating with teacher leader advisors at the LDOE. The instructional material review process is a separate process. Okay, also, we are creating instructional strategies and activities and along with the TLAs. So these are currently in development. They will also be released in spring, summer 2023. Potential entries include things like contextualization, annotation, deliberation and discussion, causation. There's like historical thinking skills that we've been talking about a lot in social studies classes. All right, next we're going to talk about some of the biggest changes for high school US history and civics. And we want to kind of frame some of the thinking behind these changes. So this is a representation of the 2022 kindergarten through 8th grade course progression. The thinking behind this progression is that students will coherently build skills and content from year to year. Skills and content are going to be built. Students are going to practice skills throughout kindergarten and through 8th grade in a way that will prepare them for the skills and practices they are expected to use in high school. This is another representation of that progression. So this is just so a representation showing how students are going to build their content knowledge from year to year and how that's going to prepare them for high school. You may have seen this graphic before, and we actually get a lot of questions about this graphic. This graphic does not represent the recommended course progression for high school. The grade level at which high school social studies courses are offered is a local decision. School systems and schools have the freedom to choose the approach that works best with the pathways of their students. However, school systems and schools should avoid placing assessed courses in the 4th year or senior year to ensure that students requiring a retest have sufficient opportunities to do so. Guidance from the department that deals with graduation requirements is communicated in the high school planning guidebook, which is updated regularly. And that is why civics and US history are represented in this graphic, because they are the common social studies courses that are included in that guidance.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about our content knowledge and our skill and practice standards. We want to reiterate that these work together as you do your instructional process for students. And now we want to start looking at our high school civic skills and practices. Remember, the 2022 high school civic standards include discrete skills and practices that should be integrated into instruction on separate content standards. It should be noted that skills and practices describe how students ought to engage with certain standards. They are always meant to be integrated into instruction together, even in isolation. So for example, let's look at our first standard. When we look at C.1, evaluate continuation and change over time. We're integrating that with the content of US government, politics, civic issues, US histories, including and related to the powers of government, interpretation of foundational documents, voting trends, citizenship, civil liberties, and civil rights. We also want to note that the civic standards are specifically called for students to practice that change or continuation over time, that causation, comparing and contrasting, contextualization, map analysis, as you can see in standards C1, C2, C3, C4, and C5. As in reference to our C2 standard, we want to alleviate any concerns you may have that if this is going to be US history and civics courses together. However, some historical content is required to make sense in civics materials. For example, once we get past our transitional years of middle school, the middle school course progressions, which is 3 years of US history, will help prepare students for the course eventually as they get ready to take civics as their testing subject in high school. Now, Samantha is about to drop the links to the crosswalks. You can see that this crosswalk, that the skills and practices are more evident in the 2022 Louisiana Social Studies standards than they were in the past 2011 GLEs. This is part of the crosswalk document that the department released in the K-12 Social Studies resource page. Now, let's look at high school U.S. history skills and practice. The 2022 Louisiana Social Studies Standards for high school history include skills and practice standards as well. These standards are similar to the historical thinking skills of the 2011 GLEs. Just remember that as we go through this process, as before, we still have those historical thinking skills that were in the 2011 GLEs, such as continuation over time, contextualization, comparing and contrasting, map analysis. But with our new standards, we go even deeper into our integration with those skills and practices. Now, when we look at our U.S. history and skills and practice, we also want you to know, as you look at U.S. History 5 and Civics 6, especially when we look at item D, it helps us to understand the progression process. Students in each grade level are expected to engage with primary and secondary sources and make claims. These skills and practices are being built throughout K through 8 to prepare students for the expectations of high school. For example, starting in the 6th grade, students are expected to evaluate counterclaims and distinguish between historical facts and historical interpretations. In high school, students will continue to evaluate counterclaims and are expected to explain how the available sources can affect how history is interpreted. Now, let's take a deeper look into our civics content. One content shift from high school civics is deliberately focuses on the inclusion of multiple historical perspectives. For example, the Federal Trade Standard as an example of the 4 federally recognized tribes of Louisiana. Also, if we look at standards C9-1 and C9I and C9J, we also see that high school civic courses now include standards that cover Louisiana government. Overall, the civic standards and all the Louisiana 2022 standards are more specific than the GLEs of 2011. Now, we really want you to look at this civic content standard. For example, this standard is very specific. The court cases that students will be expected to learn are listed here. However, we want to point out that although they are listed in the one standard, we do not expect students to learn about them all at the same time unit. For example, students would study Shank versus United States as it relates to standard C10. Evaluate how civil rights and civil liberties in the United States have developed and been protected by the US government over time in Unit 4, Topic 2. Civil rights and civil liberties, restrictions and expansion over time. The course framework will provide guidance to teachers on how to incorporate these Supreme Court cases in the units. Now, let's look at our US history content. The biggest shift in content for high school US history is the change in dates. In the 2011 GLEs, content began in 1877. In the new 2022 Louisiana Social Studies Standards, content begins in 1776. Also, the standards are more specific. Since the supporting standards are so specific, the department will not release the companion document as well for US history.
Thank you, Chandra. So while we are talking about the high school US history course, I want to mention one thing about the high school assessment because I know it's on everybody's mind. So over the next few years, the high school social studies assessment will transition from the US history assessment to a new civic assessment. The assessment required for graduation will be civics, beginning with the 2024-2025 freshman cohort. And I'm going to explain more about what a cohort is later. In the meantime, students will continue to take the LEAP 2025 U.S. History Assessment as needed for the graduation requirement. The LEAP 2025 U.S. History Assessment will maintain the same design and approach as in past administrations. As a reminder, these are the reporting categories. So these should look very familiar to you: Western expansion to progressivism, isolationism through the Great War, becoming a world power through World War II, and then the Cold War era and the modern age. So the high school U.S. history transitional framework is going to look something like this. This is the first page of it. Again, we are creating this, the department is creating this with the help of TLAs, and this is a transitional instructional framework for high school U.S. history. It's going to include guidance on how the 2011 GLEs and the 2022 Louisiana Student Standards for Social Studies overlap for high school U.S. history. This is a draft of the first page, but you can see the units, the topics, the assessment categories that I just showed you, standards, and suggested pacing. So if you look at Unit 1, founding and early development of the nation, like Chandra just said a couple minutes ago, that's going to include everything prior to 1877 that has been added to the course. And we are estimating that that should be about 2 weeks of instruction. Unit 2, the revolutionary advancements and change, that's going to correlate with the westward expansion through progressivism assessment category. Unit 3, expansion and conflict, isolationism through the Great War. Between the fires through the world at war, that's going to correlate with becoming a world power through World War II. And then the last 2 units, Unit 5 and Unit 6, they're going to correlate with the Cold War era and the modern age assessment categories. Again, this is a course framework that we expect teachers to use while the LEAP 2025 U.S. History Assessment is still operational and required for graduation for students in the cohorts that apply. This is obviously, if you are on a block schedule, the pacing here will need to be adjusted. This is the first page of the draft course framework for civics, the units, the topics, the standards, and suggested pacing. So for high school civics, Unit 1, Foundations of the United States Government. Unit 2, Government, Structure, Powers, Functions, and Interactions. Unit 3, Political, Social, and Economic Interactions. Unit 4, People of the United States. Unit 5, Elections and Politics. And then Unit 6, Economics and Personal Finance. Some of you may be wondering about this, so I just want to clarify. The civics course will not be through course assessment. So this, after students have taken the full course, they will be assessed whenever that test becomes, is field tested and then becomes operational. Okay, so now we've hit some of the major changes for the high school U.S. history and civics course. I want to pivot to talk about what teachers can begin doing prior to implementation to begin to prep for that transition. Please keep in mind, teachers are still teaching the 2011 standards or GLEs this year. High school U.S. history teachers have a state assessment aligned to the 2011 standards to prep for. We do not expect teachers to begin planning and using the standards this year, but we do want to give some general suggestions and resources about how they can begin to prepare.
As teachers begin to prepare for professional learning objectives, one thing they can do is start to build their content knowledge. One area they can build their content knowledge is the Louisiana government and high school civics. Also, they can build their knowledge in the content from 1776 to 1877 for high school and U.S. history. Remember, the first unit should only take up to about 2 weeks for instructional time during this transitional period. But remember, the first assessment reporting category for U.S. history will be the Western expansion to progressivism. Also, you want teachers to build their capacity and be comfortable with teaching and utilizing primary resources. This is especially important for civics course, which did not previously have the skills and practice standards that they do now. Louisiana government, there are several Louisiana government standards that are in the 2022 high school civic standards. teachers who are teaching civics, make sure they want to get familiar with these particular standards: C9A, C9I, C9J, C11J, and C11K. One resource teachers can use to build their content knowledge about Louisiana topics is the excellent and free online encyclopedia, 64 Parishes. Curated and run by the LEH, the website is a great place for teachers to build their content knowledge about Louisiana state history. These articles are written for general audience around the upper high school and lower college level, which makes them ideal for content knowledge building for teachers. As you will look at the screenshot here for the 64parish.org education, in addition to their regular material, the department has partnered with LEH to create articles to support the new standards, included the Louisiana Government Standard in Civics. These articles are being written as student-facing materials. Currently, articles for grades 4, 6, 7, and 8 have been released. These articles will be rewritten and be made available for high school civic students in 2023. Please see the slide for details. Although there are many resources available that cover U.S. history from 1776 to 1877, we want to share just one possible resource. The Bill of Rights Institute of an OER curriculum called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness that is arranged in chronological units and includes introductory essays for each chapter. These essays can be used to teachers to help refresh their memory on early U.S. history. Now, we're also going to start talking about a primary source guide or resource that we have produced. In this, we also want to remind teachers that the instructional process is still the same. We ask that as we go in, we help set the context for our students by introducing key terms and making connections. We help students explore sources by reading and examining sources to build their content knowledge and skills. Students then develop claims by evaluating evidence to make those connections and compare and contrast sources. And then students learn to express claims through speaking and or writing to express informed claims to support with evidence. As you can see, the screenshot of the materials that you were given that was a part of our resource for our webinar, the primary source guides, and in its content, we help to explore why the primary sources are important to use with students, what are some guidelines for using primary sources in high school, and how can graphic organizers and verbal cues support students for various types of primary sources. This is also a screenshot that can be located or found within the primary source guide that breaks down why the primary sources are important to use with our students. Next, we talk about the guidelines for integrating the primary resources in grades 9 through 12 classroom. Before you begin, perhaps choose 2 or 3 primary sources that support the learning objectives and accessible to students. Consider how students can compare these items to other primary sources and identify an analysis tool or text-dependent guiding questions that students will use to analyze the primary resources. And we're about to show you an example of a couple of these tools. This is one of the primary source documents that has a resource that is provided to help analyze maps. As you can see in this document, students could use this as a source. Teachers and students can use this to help evaluate a map Also, it provides alternate activities for teachers to utilize with their students. Also, the primary source document provides documents for analyzing things such as documents, maps, objects, photos and prints, videos, and political cartoons. These are tools that teachers and students can utilize with their 2022 Louisiana Social Studies Standards to help with skills and practice and content knowledge building.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the transition to the civics assessment. I'm dropping in the chat a document that the assessment team has put out, social studies assessment updates that might be interesting to some of you who haven't seen it. It's in the chat now. So the new LEAP civics assessment aligned to the 2022 Louisiana Student Standards for Social Studies will be field tested in 2023-2024. Participation in the field test is required by all students in grades 9 through 12 enrolled in a civics course or a course permitted to substitute for civics, such as AP US government. The primary purpose of field testing is to gather information about item performance, which is then used to develop test forms and future items. Field test assessment guides and classroom assessment items will be available by summer and fall of 2023, respectively. So a cohort is made up of all students who entered 9th grade for the first time in the state of Louisiana in a given academic year. So beginning with incoming freshmen, that freshman cohort in 2024-2025, the LEAP Civics Assessment will replace the LEAP 2025 U.S. History Assessment as the Social Studies Assessment required for graduation. The LEAP 2025 U.S. History Assessment will phase out, with the 2023-2024 freshman cohort being the last group with the U.S. History Assessment as their graduation requirement. The LEAP 2025 U.S. History Assessment will continue to be available as a state-administered test for relevant cohorts through 2026-2027, and then it will become a school system-administered test beyond that time. Again, the U.S. History Assessment will maintain the same design, alignment, and reporting categories and approach as in past administrations. The new LEAP Civics Assessment will have a set-based design, meaning most items will appear in groups alongside a collection of related source materials centered on a topic or big idea in civics. It will include set standalone items and a task that culminates in an extended response item. It will include a variety of item types, which will ask students to use their civic knowledge and skills along with the sources to demonstrate understanding of the content and concepts, such as multiple choice, multiple select, technology enhanced. And it will include a variety of source types, which will serve to activate students' knowledge and support them in answering the questions. Sources may include excerpts, charts, graphs, maps, political cartoons, etc. Right, so I just want to give y'all a second to reflect on what we've talked about today, to determine how prepared you feel that you are to communicate the following. So what supports for high school teachers will the department be releasing? We talked about our instructional material review process, our course frameworks, our instructional strategies that we will be releasing spring, summer 2023. What are the major changes in content and skills for high school civics and U.S. history? Remember, for high school U.S. history, the change in dates from 1877 to 1776, that is an important shift in content, but please keep in mind the what we told you about the cohorts and the assessment that will continue to be necessary for students to graduate. The inclusion of skills and practices for civics, and also the inclusion of Louisiana government and civics, as well as just the standards being overall more specific or granular. How can high school teachers begin to prepare for the transition to the new social studies standards and assessment? So we gave you just some ideas about how teachers can build content knowledge on that will help them with those shifts in content. The Louisiana 64 parishes articles are fantastic. Also, the Bill of Rights Institute can help build content knowledge for that early U.S. history that's going to be added to the high school U.S. history course. And then we also went over some transition information that's important when you're thinking about the civics assessment that will be coming. So Here are the resources and contact. If you have any questions about standards, implementation, curriculum, please email classroom support toolbox@la.gov. If you have specific questions about the assessment, you can email assessment@la.gov with those questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.